I have one simple scripture today in honor of Independence Day. All we need is one scripture. And we'll put it up there. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land and unto all the inhabitants thereof. Proclaim liberty throughout the land. That's on our Liberty Bell. That's scripture. You would never hear that in modern school systems because supposedly religion never existed in our country, specifically Christianity. It never existed. The founding fathers weren't Christian. Our Constitution wasn't based on it. The Declaration wasn't based on it. And our country is purely secular, and the atheists known as Thomas Jefferson and Washington and Franklin made sure that there'd be no religion in our country because it was an evil thing. Well, anybody who is at all familiar with the history of a country knows that's absolutely false. Unfortunately, it's not taught in the schools anymore. Here is an example of what is not taught in the schools anymore. Washington's farewell address was in every kid's school books from the time we were a country until the 60s. This is required reading for our students, and to remember it, actually, his farewell address. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead me to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens, morality and religion, two pillars. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect the national morality can prevail in exclusion of religion principle. That was required reading in our country up until fairly recently in God's history. That one final quote, another one from him, he said at one point in another speech, "It is impossible to rightly govern the world without God in the Bible." Impossible. This is one of the most devout Christians in our country, and he was the greatest leader, without a doubt. He stood in prayer on his knees every night, as I said in a prior sermon. Every single night, when not in the battle, in the heat of battle, he was on his knees in prayer every night, to the point where his family knew not to bother him and his aides knew not to disturb him unless it was a critical emergency. He depended wholly on Christianity and the tenets of Christianity to govern not only himself, but the country. From the beginning, our country, from the very beginning, when the Puritans landed on Plymouth Rock, the idea that this was going to be a new Israel, the new Jerusalem, was established. They'd landed, they needed supplies, they were tired, it was a long journey, they got off the boat, and the day they got off the boat was a Sunday, and so they didn't do anything except pray and read the Bible. As tired, as hungry, as cold as they were, the first thing they did when they got to our country is pray. And they took the day off because it was the Sabbath. That chain and that line of thinking, the religious thinking and Christian thinking in particular, stayed solidly through our country's existence until the last century, the middle of the last century. There was no doubt about our history and our founding. One of the biggest issues that we have in our country today is that the revisionists are saying that we weren't religious, and they are rewriting not only that they weren't religious, but the fact that they believed in God in the first place. Some of them will say, some atheistic revisionists will say that they were Christian, but they kept it apart, the separation of church and state nonsense. That's bogus. But other ones would go so far as to say they were atheists. Thomas Paine, the most reviled of the founding fathers, from all the other founding fathers, because of his outspoken stance against God, still believed in God. He just didn't believe in a God that was the one that jumped into the lives of people, the personal God. And he wrote against God, but he believed in God, even him. Benjamin Franklin, during the Constitutional Convention, after we had won the war, incidentally, we'll step back. One of the first things the Continental Congress did when we decided to break off and become independent was order 20,000 Bibles from Europe because we didn't have the ability to print them quick enough or fast enough here for the troops. Washington ordered 20,000 Bibles instantly for the men. He knew how important they were. The first time the Declaration of Independence was read was on July 7th in the First Church in Philadelphia to the congregants there, I think they're Episcopalian, by Reverend Duché. Now, Duché and all of the other preachers in our country had to use a certain book, a prayer book, that was state ordained. It had the King George's name in it, and it had the Church of England in it, and the prayers pretty much were supplements for the king, for the country, and then God. Well, for the first time in our history, and probably the Church of England's history, Duché took the names out, didn't use those prayers, and for the first time prayed for our country and for the independent United States. But more importantly, he took away that church and state thing. They've always maintained they didn't want the state to control the church. They wanted the church to control the state. That was explicit. They knew by many, many, many quotes, we know that the founding fathers feared a country that was not run under the tenets of Christianity. John Adams said, quote, "We have no government armed with the power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to govern any other." If you take God out of the equation, he knew our system would fail, and it's failing us now. Yet our teachers will insist that our founding fathers didn't believe or didn't want to have them in the town square. James Madison, quote, "We have staked the future of government not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all our political institutions on the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God." Period. That's his thought. I read this before from Jefferson. I'll read it again. He wrote, "The precepts of philosophy," quote, "the precepts of philosophy and of the Hebrew code laid hold to actions only, like our modern judicial system, because there's nothing backing it now except a recourse from our government. Jesus, however, pushed his scrutinies into the heart of man, erected his tribunal into the region of his thoughts, and purified the waters at the fountainhead. Morality cannot be legislated. It has to be innate, it has to be taught, or it has to be believed. That morality comes not only from belief in Christianity, but you have to have belief in a God first. And if you remove that, everything else falls apart. So I've said this before. Many atheists know at heart there is no moral basis apart from God. Even atheistic philosophers will say that anybody who thinks that they can try to legislate morality or find some system on which you can base morality, they're deluding themselves. It's impossible if, in fact, we take out the transcendent creator that makes us all one and makes us all equal. If you remove the concept of God, morality goes along with it, and as well as good and evil. But I'm getting outside of the message right here. So anyway, I was telling Ben Franklin, the war's over, they're having the Constitutional Convention, they're debating on what should be in it and not in it, and the states were arguing amongst themselves. Some wanted slaves, some didn't. All the different, little things that were going on. And he finally stopped them and said, and pointed out, if I have the quote here, I'll read it, pointed out that the country that they've already forgotten why it was they were successful in fighting the British. And it was a simple fact that we had divine providence. I'm not sure if I have that. I have a different quote from him. But anyway, he asked for a time of prayer every morning. He said, we need to get back to where we started. Divine providence got us here, and we'll surely lose that providence if we forgot how we got here. And so he asked for prayer from that day forward. I don't think it was instituted, but the point was, he's another one who's held up to be a deist, meaning he didn't really believe in a God. Well, he believed in a God that didn't interject. Deists don't pray, because they don't believe it's heard by a God who does anything. So that's nonsense. If you see somebody asking for prayer or praying, they have to believe the prayer is going to be answered, or possibly could be heard, or definitely be heard, possibly answered by a God who can do something. He was not a deist. He was a religionist. He was a Christian like all of the rest. And he was one of the strongest and most outspoken persons against Thomas Paine. When Thomas Paine wrote a thing, something very caustic thing against God, he suggested as a friend to burn it all. Don't let anybody see it, because he was one of the first to read it, and forget you ever wrote it. Because that's how vehemently against the idea that God was unimportant. This is something he said. Here's a quote from Franklin that I do have. The worship of God is a duty. Freedom is not a gift bestowed upon us by other men, but by a right that belongs to us by the laws of God and nature. He who should introduce into public office the principles of Christianity will change the face of the world. Oh, here's the one of the prayer. I do have it. I apologize. I have no numbers on here, and I dropped them. So I'm trying to work my way through it. And, okay, this is what he read to Congress, what he said to Congress. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. He said, in the beginning of the contest, with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. That's when the Continental Congress was meeting during the war. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. To that kind providence, we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And now, have we forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings and deliberations be held in this assembly every morning. Now he suggested take a pastor or a priest or a reverend from all the different denominations and like a rotation. He didn't want to, again, he wanted to be equitable. They didn't do it, to my knowledge. But if you want to know what happened and why we have our articles, if you're interested, and how the Constitution ended up to be the way it did, you need to read Farron's notes on it. There's two people that took notes. I think Adam might have been one. But a second one was a guy named Farron. And the huge voluminous opus of all of the proceedings and the debates and everything and why he came up with the different articles. One of the big ones we hear sometimes from left-leaning people in our country that the article about the 3/5 compromise, I think Brad's probably familiar with it. There's a compromise saying that blacks are counted as 3/5 a person. Nowadays, it's thrown in our face, people meaning conservatives and Christians, that our angry white slave-owning forefathers didn't think black people were citizens and they weren't equal to human beings. And that's thrown out in talk all the time, in political talk. The reality was they had to compromise, and the people who were anti-slavery, who were abolitionists, had to compromise with people who owned slaves. The people who owned slaves wanted to count them as a full person so they can use them for voting. And then if they voted, they would control Congress, and it would never be a non-slave situation. They wanted to control, and obviously the other side knew better, so they said, well, the angle they originally was, well, you claim that they're property and you own them. How can property vote? A chair can't vote. So after much debate, the agreement was to count them as 3/5 a person. And if it wasn't for that compromise, the great compromise I call it, the slavery would have went a lot farther in our country. Other countries did go farther than ours after this. But slavery would have lasted a lot longer because they would have had a supermajority down there, and they would have never enacted anti-slavery laws. You need to go back to the original writings, just like anything else, and to the debates to find out what in fact something's meant. And things like words change. Here's another thing that most people don't realize. Words change meanings fairly easily. Egregious used to mean great. But people started using it so much as sarcastically, with sarcasm, that now we use egregious as like an offense. It's an offense. It's a bad offense. So the simple words like that will change meanings, and if you don't catch it, if you read, say, an article from an old newspaper or the debates, or even if you go back to the ancient times and you read the ancient writings about Christianity, or the earliest writings on Christianity, if you don't know that words change meaning, you're useless. So you need to know context, not just context in the day and age, but but actually in the word usage themselves. But anyway, I had notes here. Maybe I'll start on those. So anyway, the first time the Declaration was read, it was in church, because most of the signers went to that church, and they were there to hear it. A couple of decades later, a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville, French philosopher, came to our country. He had just basically saw the tail end, because he was young, I think in his 20s, the tail end of the French Revolution. Our revolution was guided by divine providence, if you listen to any of the writings of our founding fathers. So we ended up with a constitutional convention where people debated, argued, and did what they did to hammer out the Constitution. Now, some people say the Declaration is what we believe, and the Constitution is how it's enacted in our country. The Declaration, Thomas Jefferson refers to our Creator and nature's law. When he means nature's law, it means the law of God. Not like now when you hear a naturalist or materialist say the natural world. They're talking about material, period. Material and the laws of physical world, the laws of gravity, of such things like that. Jefferson, in that time frame, all those people, John Locke, the laws of nature meant the natures of God, God's nature, what he did, what he provided for us. Well, our Declaration of Independence is based entirely on the supposition God gave us our rights. Even though they were in an imperfect world with slavery, Jefferson knew that the only true way of equality is basing it upon a higher power. You cannot have equality apart from God in this country. In this universe, not even world, in this universe. We go across the water to France at the same time frame the French Revolution was going. They did it totally on a secular basis, and it devolved into a bloodbath. The guillotine took tens of thousands of people's lives, and whomever was in charge or had the most power, whichever faction, basically got rid of the other ones. And it went back and forth for a long time, and this is what Alex de Tocqueville saw. He wrote a book, Democracy in America, and was stunned when he got here on how much Christ or how much religion was a part of our system, and he basically compared the two. If it wasn't for, I can't say if it wasn't for our religion, we would be as bad, but the Founding Fathers believed it, and he knew that the fact that French didn't believe, they were a secular society, they were just might makes right through the whole revolution until finally they came to their senses. But here's a couple of quotes from this guy, and the reason why I read this is because, again, the revisionists will say that really they didn't really base a lot on religion, and our country wasn't as religious as we think it was. Well, this is what he wrote in Democracy in America. Quote, upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. And the longer I stayed there, the more I perceived the great political consequences resulting from the new state of things. There's a French philosopher who lived in a secular society, who saw how their revolution went, came over here and he immediately realized why ours didn't go that way. It didn't go sour. He wrote again about, you do know the French Revolution was a bloodbath. It was insane compared to ours. Well, he wrote again, in France I had almost seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom marching in opposite directions. But in America I found they were intimately united and that they reigned in common over the same country. Again, another quote. Religion in America must be regarded as the foremost of the political institutions of that country, for if it does not impart a taste for freedom, it facilitates the use of it. Indeed, it is in the same point of view that the inhabitants of the United States themselves look upon religious beliefs. They knew our political system was interwoven with religion, with Christianity specifically. And then here's one other one, one final one. In the United States, the sovereign authority is religious. There is no country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. And there can be no greater proof of its utility and its conformity to human nature than that its influence is powerfully felt over the most enlightened and free nation of the earth. He knew Christianity, he saw it everywhere, and he saw that, because of that, the freedom of our country and the greatness of our country. He talks later about the greatness, and he bases it totally on the fact that we were Christian. He comments, which I think is great because of the legal aspect that I've said, that even... Maybe step back a little bit, take a breath. Christianity has been the forerunner of economic systems, of political systems, of scientific systems. I'm going to get into touch on science a little bit about what I mean by that, not about science specifically. The social systems, education in our country and around the world started from Christian, the monasteries started eventually the universities. But our system here, a social system of education, public education, orphanages, everything that makes Western culture what it is, was based on Christianity, including our legal system. Here's something that was in New York State, and he happened, I guess, either be at the courtroom or read it, but he commented on it. He goes, "While I was in America, a witness in court who happened to be called to the county of Chester, state of New York," that's Port actually right next to where I grew up, "declared that he did not believe in the existence of God or the immortality of the soul. The judge refused to admit his evidence on the ground that the witness had destroyed beforehand all confidence of the court in what he was about to say." Okay? When they swore on the Bible, they meant it, and they believed it. The newspapers related the fact without further comment, but then he said he found a comment in a different newspaper. This is 1830, roughly, 1831. "The Court of Common Pleas of Chester County a few days since rejected a witness who declared his disbelief in the existence of God. The presiding judge remarked that he had not before been aware that there was a man living who did not believe in the existence of God. That this belief constituted the sanction of all testimony in a court of justice, and that he knew of no case in a Christian country where a witness had been permitted to testify without a belief." That's how Christian our country was, so to speak. There was a court case I mentioned a few months ago. I didn't have the details. It's the Church of Holy Trinity versus United States. The reason why I'm using I'm mentioning this case is a country's history is found in its legal system, its legal decisions. We have our tenets, we have our platforms on which a country's built, and then whether or not how that's acted out is through our court system. If you follow the trail of papers through a court system, you'll see how a country used to act compared to how it acts now. All we have to do is look at the comparison of how Christianity was treated in the earlier times and now, and we can see exactly what is going on with our country. Well, here's one in People v. Ruggles in New York in 1811. The judge declared that an attack against Jesus is an attack against our country. Okay, that's one. And then this one in 1892, a century after our Constitution was created, there were dozens of cases coming up in the court about different legal proceedings, religious proceedings, Well, this case, the Church of Holy Trinity versus United States in the Supreme Court, cited 87 prior precedents. Among those precedents was Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Course about the separation of church and state, used to protect religion in our country's system, political and legal system. It was used a dozen times opposite to how it's used now, prior to 1947, to uphold the idea that we're a Christian country. So among these 87 precedents, that was included, and to make it very brief, the decision, just a summary of the decision, it said, "Our laws and our institutions must necessarily be based upon and embody the teachings of the Redeemer of mankind." Imagine that in a legal proceeding nowadays. "It is impossible that it should be otherwise, and in a sense and to this extent, our civilization and our institutions are emphatically Christian. This is a Christian nation." And that wasn't debated until 1940s. That was in 1892, so another 70 years. So our system is founded upon it. Our legal system was. There was a thing called Blackstone's Commentary of English Law you might be familiar with. It was the founding works of our legal system. It was based entirely on the Old Testament commandments and the laws that governed the Israelites. Our legal system with the three branches, that's an Israelite. That came right from the Israelites' transition from Egypt into the Promised Land. That was the legal system that eventually was put into place. So we, as a country, were the first country really to found a system based on Christianity without a king being the head of the church. It was a republic, and it worked well for a long, long time. They did a study. I don't have it quoted here. There was a study done a number of years ago where they took the thousands of our founding fathers' letters and looked at their quotes as they wrote to each other in different places, and they took all the quotes and listed them in certain groupings, whether it was religious, John Locke, who was one of the Enlightenment people, Ross Thoreau, all the different people, and more than a third of them were from the Bible, and the majority of them were from the Old Testament. And so by far and away, the biggest influence, if you base it on, I think it was up to like 15,000 quotations from all our founding fathers. If you base on who they're quoting, like I'm doing now, you got to believe I believe the founding fathers are Christian, and I believe in my founding fathers. They did the same thing. They quoted the Bible consistently to each other in comparison to a legal situation, to a problem, to a person, how they're acting. They constantly went and referred back to the Bible, even in their own writings to each other. I do have it right here. I don't know why I keep missing these things. The University of Houston, forgive me, I don't like to quote things unless I have the information. But the University of Houston did a study. It lasted 10 years. 15,000 documents. Of the 3,100 direct quotes, 34% were taken directly from the Bible. A third of the quotes that they wrote in their letters. How many people quote the Bible in their daily writings and emails here? You know, I mean, they did it consistently because that's where they placed their faith. Whenever they wanted to refer to something, they referred to God as why they're doing something, whatever it is they're doing or whatever it is they believe. Here's one you'll never hear on the mainstream media. Here's a quote from John Quincy Adams. The highest glory of the American Revolution was this, that it connected in one indissoluble bond civil government with the principles of Christianity. Separation of church and state? This guy just said, the founding father, that it connected them totally together. Anybody who reads the letter of Jefferson, incidentally, he wants to hear separation of church and state. It was to the Danbury Baptist Church. And they were concerned that the Bill of Rights were going to end up in the situation that we're in right now. They were right. They used it as a foot in the door to change and reverse what it meant. It went from establishment of no federal denomination, which is all it was for, and to allow people to do what they want religiously, wherever they wanted, to what we have now. Prior to 1947, though, his letters stood to defend religion in the public square. Andrew Jackson's not quite a founding father, but he said the Bible is the rock on which our republic rests. So it didn't stop the progression. I can give more. Theodore Roosevelt. In this actual world, a churchless community, a community where men have abandoned and scoff at or ignored the Christian duties, is a community on rapid downgrade. We live in that community right now. And to go even further on the idea that to show that our country was founded on the tenets of Christianity, and there was no hiding that fact to the early people, I have a couple constitutions, state constitutions, that talk about what you need to do to be in office there. Delaware Constitution, Everyone serving a public office must affirm this statement: I do profess faith in God the Father, and in the Lord Christ, His only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore, and I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. You have to say that. You had to say that to be in office in Delaware. Massachusetts, one of the most liberal states we have now. All persons elected to office must make the following declaration: I do declare that I believe the Christian religion and have firm persuasion of its truth. The Tennessee Constitution sort of reverses it. It says, no person who denies the being of God or a future state of rewards and punishment, which is intrinsic, incidentally, the idea of the redemption from resurrection, by the way. Without that, we have nothing. We have a worldview that tells us to be nice to each other. But the resurrection affirms the future hope and glory that we have now, or the future hope and glory, and the glory that we have now as a Christian. But anyway, it says, no person who denies the being of God or future state of rewards and punishment shall hold any office in the civil department of the state. So you had to affirm being a Christian to get a civil job in the past. Now if you say it, you're fired. Here's the ironic quote from Supreme Court Justice Bear versus Cal Morgan, in the case in 1958. He actually says in the dissent, if this court doesn't stop talking about the separation between church and state, then the people will start thinking it's part of the Constitution. Imagine a Supreme Court said that, and exactly what happened. Let me see if I can flip back to something I wanted to read. The first Supreme Court justice in our country, speaking of Supreme Court justice